experience Umbria through the European Union's
Hello, everyone. We're all really excited to be here today. I'm really excited about sitting next to this amazing group of journalists. Julie Pace heads our Associated Press. We've got Sarah Alvarez, who is a founder and leads Outlier Media in Detroit, and Andrew, who is actually the publisher and president of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks.
So we will dive in. I think all of us have had a number of conversations, read a number of studies over the years about trust in the media. It feels like it's a problem we've been wrestling with for many, many decades. And when I was thinking about trust in the media, I was thinking about, what my early recollections of what the media did for communities that I really cared about. And for me, I thought about Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and how instrumental journalism was in truly changing the lives and even changing major policies in our lifetime. Some of you are younger than us, but definitely in my lifetime. And so I thought I would open up by asking our panelists to really dive in on, when you think about trust in the media, what comes to mind first? Who wants to start?
I'll kick it off. Small question, and thank you guys for joining us today. So, look, I think about a couple of things when I think about trust in the media. I think the first thing that I think about is the lack of trust in the media, and then the second thing I think about is what is the role that we have played in leading to that situation, and I know we'll talk about that a bit, and then, of course, how do we get it back? And I think that when we talk about this from a local perspective, I think that some of the lack of trust is really infused with the fact that we've seen local publications just reducing staff, facing business realities, having to cut back on a lot of the things that actually did build trust. Because at the local level, and Sarah and Andrew can obviously speak about this because they're right in the thick of it right now, a lot of what helps you build trust at the local level is actually not the big accountability journalism. It's not the big investigation. It's being that daily presence in people's lives, giving them information that they just need to understand what's going on in their communities. It can be things like what's happening in local sports. It can be what businesses are opening, what businesses are closing. It's just being that reliable source of information. And a lot of that is what has gone away in some of these communities, and what's left has not always felt connected to people. And so I think that that's really part of what has happened in eroding some of the trust.
Very good points.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Sarah. I'm from Outlier Media in Detroit. There's Outlier stickers and other things in the back. When I think about this question, I really think about, what is it that we're really trying to talk about? Because I think that a lack of trust could actually be other things. It's often a lack of utility. It's a lack of interest. I think when people say, I don't trust you, what they're really saying is I'm not engaging. I do not want this. Go away. And so that's a set of questions that's really about how do you increase your utility, how do you increase your relevance, and then I think there's another set of questions that's also very hard, which is about even when people want you, even in local news, when people do see your value, when information is particularly challenging, either because it's unwelcome or because it's very complicated, I think that there's another set of activities that you need to do, because what people really need is to be accompanied through information, and it's not really a lack of trust, it's like a lack of ability to process, to deal, and reporting and newsrooms aren't often set up to do that kind of work, and we don't really take in information communally anymore, and we used to do that more when we would watch the news with other people, or you'd read the paper at the same place every morning, or you'd talk about it in school. And now that everything's very personalized, we need to think of new ways to accompany people through information. And I think that's part of what's bound up in this conversation.
Yeah, look, I think trust comes down to basic human connection. There was a point in time when Walter Cronkite was known as the most trusted man in America, and he was because virtually every household in America would sit and turn on their television and watch them when something important happened, whether it was the moon landing or the JFK assassination or the Vietnam War. And there was a visceral human connection because it's something everybody was doing and it was a part of their daily lives. I saw it earlier in my career when I was a field producer for many years, traveling around the world. And you would land in a new place and you'd have your camera and you'd walk into a community, whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq or Gaza, and the people on the ground got to know you and you would spend time with them and there was basic human connection as you reported all over the world. We feel that every day in local news, and it's one of the great things about local news that's really important, and it's why I think often local news will trend higher than national or global news in terms of trust. We're out in the community. People are shaking our hands. Your kids are going to the same schools. I think because things have gotten so disaggregated, people sometimes don't trust the media because they don't know who we are. So getting back out and about, out into the field, shaking people's hands and meeting them, I think is a way that we can restore trust.
Very good points, and I came from local news most of my career, and you're absolutely right. I think we do tend better, but we're also facing the same division with some people just saying, we're gonna label you liberal media or conservative media and just ignore you, depending on your community. What's interesting to me, and when I look at all the studies that have been done over recent years, is frankly the differences in the trust percentages across the world. And so Finland, for example, has some of the highest trust scores in the world at 69%. You get down to Hong Kong at 39%. I believe we have Ireland at 47%. And here we are, USA, 32%. We pretty frequently and consistently over the years have the lowest percentage. Why do you guys think that is?
Well, I think some of it is about what's happening outside of the media as well. I mean, I don't think you can disconnect those figures from the fact that you have very powerful people. This is not just, what's happening right now with the president, but you have very powerful people who have launched sustained attacks on the media. And over time, that has an effect. It just does. The other thing that obviously has happened is that, we are increasingly just one source of information that people are getting, and so we're being compared to other inputs. And some of those inputs are really positive, I think. I mean, I think there's so much that I think sort of traditional media can and has been learning from content creators and people who are very authentic and taking people, into places and telling them what it looks like and feels like and drawing that human connection. I think that, in comparison to sometimes the kind of voice of God from the media, sometimes we haven't felt as trustworthy compared to somebody who just has that real authenticity. But of course, the flip side of that is there are also sources of just misinformation that are battering people and getting pushed to them by really powerful algorithms that shape a narrative. And so I think it's like in that soup that we see in the United States that there is a real lack of trust that has become very embedded. The Finns are also very happy, so we should learn some other lessons from them too, in addition to maybe it's because they trust their media that they're so happy.
That's the reason
I'm sure that's it. So yeah, I do think that social platforms have a lot to do with this, right? Like, even though they're very dependent on news organizations for content, I think they see themselves as oppositional. So it is in their interest to make news less trusted and make their platforms an alternative. So I think that's happening. But I also think one reason why I feel like local news tends to do better than national news in terms of trust, and something that also kind of explains this United States issue, is that I think it's very difficult to deliver information across serious lines of difference. And so in more multicultural societies, I think you're going to have less trust in very kind of top-down media. Even in local communities that are very diverse, there's usually a lot of commonality, and people there really understand how to deliver information in a way that reflects that commonality. But I don't think that's happening at a national level. And then you have these social platforms that are really designed to make difference extremely loud. So I think that that's also part of what we've got going on.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'd add two other things. Look, I think in the U.S., the distrust of the media, you can actually trace it back to the founding the country, and it was totally contradictory. But like Thomas Jefferson on the one hand would argue for the importance of the free press, and then on the other, if you read some of the things Thomas Jefferson said about newspapers, it would make you blush. Like it would make Donald Trump seem, kind and gentle. So it's like it's always been set up there, frankly, is another check and balance in the country, where you have the three branches of government and you have the fourth estate. And so I do think the government, and our elected officials in the United States have always used the press as a bit of a foil and then tried to play the press when it served their advantages. The other thing, though, that I think factors in, so A, it's been there for a while, but the second factor is that, when you pick up a paper, when you're in the UK or you're in Italy for that matter, there are liberal papers and there are conservative papers, and it's been that way for generations. And people tend to trust their tribes, and really that's only been the case in the US the way it is now for the last 25 years with cable news, where like you either support Fox over here or MSNBC over there. So it's a relatively new phenomenon. So I do think the tribalism to a certain degree, which is accepted throughout Europe, is a little bit of a new thing in the US. Or the idea that like we're balanced centrist media, that can't be trusted because you're not telling me what I believe.
It's a very interesting perspective, and I think you and Julie both have raised some good points about, how do we get here? Some of the research that we've read, and we hear this in our communities, it's because you don't have people who look like me, covering me. You only show up for negative news, or you've been laying off a bunch of people. I haven't seen someone show up at my meeting in 10 years. We've been laying off because of the significant financial struggles. Earlier, we heard a lot about some of the other panels about, journalists are great journalists, but they're not the best business leaders. And so part of it is our own business models and how we put things behind a paywall. We've had to protect ourselves and our journalists more because of security threats. Most of us don't allow commenting on our sites. Most of us just gave our content to Google and whoever else and didn't think about the consequences of that. So I guess the question is, who's to blame, what's to blame? I mean, there's a lot that we could pick at here.
Look, I'll have to say, and this may be a little unpopular, but I think we have to look in the mirror to some degree. I really do. I think there are plenty of factors that have worked against us. Changing consumer behaviors, the platforms, Donald Trump, there are all these factors that have worked against us, but the reality is we didn't innovate fast enough. We didn't serve our readers fast enough. We didn't change the way other industries changed to embrace technology. We didn't early enough understand that having a sound business model is a good thing and a way to sustain journalism. And frankly, I think we lost our way a little bit in recent years as we have been on the defensive and we've taken punches. It's always hard when a bully's pushing you around, you want to punch back, but when you do, it sometimes throws you off course. So I think there are plenty of factors that we have to deal with, but I also think it's really important that we look ourselves in the mirror and say, how can we do better?
I think that's really true. I also think that in that vein, I'm a investigative reporter. That's my favorite kind of reporting to do and personally also to consume. But I think when we do really hard-hitting work, we have to understand that, if we're decreasing trust in institutions, that we're also that's gonna blow back onto the institution of the press. And so it doesn't mean we shouldn't do that work. We should absolutely do that work. But I do think that newsrooms need to also do things that are generative and really make a civic space healthier. There's an amazing program out of Chicago called the Documenters Program that many people probably know about. If you don't know about it, look it up, where you train people and pay them to take notes at city meetings, county meetings, community meetings, introduce that stuff into the record. We run a program like that. That means that we have 750 Detroit documenters. There's a lot of Detroiters that are very much actively engaged in this civic project with us. And I don't think enough newsrooms really work to say, if we're going to criticize things, if we're going to tell you not to believe this, not to have faith in this, then what are we going to do together to increase faith in our civic project?
Well, I think inherent in what you're saying there, which I think is really important, is that you're thinking about the audience, right? You're thinking about who's on the receiving end of your journalism. And look, things like, having to lay off staff and reduce costs, like that is all a very real set of pressures. But I think one of the things that, news organizations can control is just making sure that every day you're showing up and thinking about not like, what do I want to see, but what does the audience want to see? And we talk about this a lot at the AP, and there are a couple AP people here, and I'm sure this sounds familiar to them. We got a lot of eye rolls when we started talking about this, but we really are focused on trying to make sure that the report is infused with stories of, we call it joy, wonder, and discovery, right? Which doesn't mean that at the AP we are not covering what's happening in the White House and what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Ukraine and everything in between. Of course we are. But I think about it from the perspective of myself, right? Like I want to know what's happening in all of those stories. And I also want to know about, Taylor Swift going to the Chiefs game. And I want to read a movie review. And I want to know about white asparagus season in Germany. Like I'm a full human being and I like a range of stories. And sometimes when we go into covering things, though, we only think about the hard, tough news. And I think the audience sometimes just tunes us out as a result.
It's a very good point. And I think, for a lot of people, when you're thinking about limited resources, you also have to see that as a full report for the community. So what's amazing and also where we can get better. And so I love that perspective you shared. So I'm going to also kind of take this next question with you. AP itself has been in the news a lot lately. I'd love you to share with our audience, and so anybody who doesn't know, if you've probably heard of this, but the Gulf of Mexico, and AP said we are not going to change our style, and we're not going to call it the Gulf of Americas. And as a result, there were some consequences to that. Your press corps was kicked out of the White House, and you guys have been challenging that legally. I'll point out that I don't know of any other time in my journalism career, and I'm old, where we have faced so many legal pressures from the elected officials, in some cases from our communities. And so it's expensive, but it's needed. And so I really applaud you guys for taking this stance. You got some wonderful news this week. But I'd love you to share with our audience, tell me why you guys took that stance, why it's so important to battle, and kind of what are the next steps for that process?
Sure. No, thank you. It's a weird situation. It's a weird situation for a lot of reasons, but it's a weird situation because on the one hand, it can feel like it's this very small thing, right? Whether we're going to call the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, but it's also something so much bigger than that. It's about whether the government of the United States can tell a news organization what to say and retaliate against them if they don't do what they want. And that was the principle that we were really standing up for here. And not just for the AP. This was a stand that we are taking for all news organizations and really all people in the United States, because this notion of, free speech, this is something that I think all Americans, no matter their political persuasion, believe in really deeply. It's fundamental for us. And so, we wrestled with this because nobody wants to be in this position suing the government, suing the White House in the first couple of months of the administration. We are a fact-based, nonpartisan news organization that actively tries to reach audiences across the political spectrum. We don't want to be seen as oppositional. We're not oppositional, but we had to take this stand on principle. And we were really gratified this week that a judge affirmed our First Amendment rights, asserted that we needed to be reinstated into being allowed to cover White House events. The government has appealed, but this was the outcome that we were hoping for. And I just have to say that I am incredibly proud of our White House reporters and photographers who, through 2 months of this, showed up every single day to be turned away. They still found ways to do their jobs. They were incredibly creative, incredibly resourceful, made sure that we were still there, because we deliver news to 4 billion people around the world every day. 4 billion people. We have an enormous responsibility, and they were just the ultimate professionals, and I'm really mostly happy for them and our audiences that we'll be back in there doing what we do.
So I guess I will follow up a little bit from your statement and just ask, how do you feel this will play out for your access down the road? And also, very necessary step. I think we all were just rooting for you guys, and if we had a kit of collection, I'm sure we'd give you some money to help you keep going if we had to. But more importantly, how do you think your community and for you guys, it's a worldwide community and network, but do you think this is going to help reinforce the trust that you have with some of your audience?
I hope so. I mean, what we hope, and again, we've been really clear about this when we've been talking about this over the last 2 months. This is not about the AP fighting the White House. This is not about the AP fighting Donald Trump. This is about the AP standing up for a principle that all Americans believe in. All Americans want the ability to say what's on their minds, to have an opinion, to not be retaliated against for that opinion. That is shared by liberals and conservatives. And I would hope that people would see us as standing up for their rights there. Now, I'm also not naive. I recognize what the conversation has been around this, but then that's on us, right? That's on us as people are coming to the AP, looking at our news report. We talk about this a lot internally. When there are a lot of eyes on you, you want to make sure that you are putting your best foot forward and you are living up to that notion for us of being that nonpartisan news organization. So I hope that over the last couple of months, as people have been watching us, they see that we are a news organization that really wants to reflect a range of perspectives and wants people to feel like they may not agree with everything we write and report, and that's okay, but that we're trying to reflect kind of the whole of America and the whole of the world.
Sarah, I'll turn to you, kind of very different news organization. So you founded Outlier Media, you're the editor-at-large in Detroit, a community that I think if you know anything about Detroit, it's got so much history, there's strong community bonds. You've got some major local news organizations that have been there, but owned by big conglomerates over the years. And so I know there's a lot of people in Detroit who feel neglected, but the renaissance of Detroit is fascinating. The resurgence there, the revitalization. So walk us through why you decided at a time when trust was declining and has been to really step out and say, I'm going to do this. And how's it going? I mean, what are you hoping your community will accomplish, what you accomplish with your community? And I just want to share here that you said on the website that you believe the best local reporting is a service, responds directly to community needs, and reduces harm.
Yep. So I think part of the reason that I really wanted to start Outlier was because I think that lack of trust was totally deserved inside of the city. It was like, it was not a news desert. We do have a lot of news organizations. I often say it's like a news donut, where there's like a bunch of news organizations inside Detroit that report for the suburbs and report for, frankly, wealthier, whiter people who live outside of the city. And Detroiters were understandably upset that they were being underserved. So I really wanted to be able to provide a news service inside of the city of Detroit. But I knew, like, nobody knows me. Like, I don't have, I didn't have, like, a name. Outlier was totally new. Nobody trusted it. So the way that I really tried to build trust was to demonstrate that we were deserving of it. And the first product that we had is a text message-based product. We still have it, that lets people look up information that they can verify pretty easily on their own. So who owns your home? Because we have a lot of renters, because a lot of housing is turned over. So who really owns your house? Is it at risk of tax foreclosure? Has it been inspected lately? If there's problems with it or problems with your landlord, do you want to talk to a reporter about that? That is something that is not about, we deserve your trust, please give it to us. It's like, we are trying to earn your trust. Did we do it? And I think that one of the ways I think news organizations can build trust easily is to use news judgment, but to step back from that, like, decision maker of what is important, right? So we do a lot of rigorous surveys. The University of Michigan runs our surveys for us to find out what people really want discussed and where people's biggest accountability and information gaps are, and we change our beats based on those surveys every year. So we are using news judgment, we are using news skills, but we are not that voice of God saying this is what's important. let us educate you. We are saying we have skills, we have access to people, and we are going to direct those skills and that access to the issues that you've said need to be fixed. And we just work in service of that.
Can you give us an example of something maybe you were doing, but based on your research and the discussions you had with the community, you said we're going to stop doing it and change the beat to this?
I will give you a slightly different example, but it's this question. So for one, okay, focus. So information is much easier to get from the government because they have to give it to us. So we have, the ability to FOIA things. And so in Detroit, a couple of years ago, we were hearing a lot about water shutoffs, which were happening. They're about to start happening again. People who couldn't afford their water bills were being shut off. There were so many stories about this. There were celebrities who came to Detroit to protest in the streets about water shutoffs. Water shutoffs are very important. However, part of the reason that there were so many stories was because the water department had to give us their shutoff numbers when we asked. And what Detroiters actually wanted dealt with in bigger numbers was electricity shutoffs. When people were asked about their accountability and information gaps, it was about electric shutoffs. But there's a corporation, DTE Energy, that runs, our electricity. And I did not want to be a utility reporter. I really did not want to do utility reporting. But it was clear that that is actually what people wanted. They want accountability for DTE, which still does not have very much accountability, and the water issue was actually understood. It was this thing, and we really needed to shift not just our newsroom, but other newsrooms to start reporting on that. And that was hard because DTE likes to give a lot of money to news organizations, but not Outlier, which we wouldn't take their money anyway.
It's a great example. So Andrew, what you guys are doing at the AJC, I think a lot of us have been reading about and are just so excited about your future. And so let me just kind of walk the audience through some of the things that are taking place there, and we'd love you to talk about it. So when a lot of news organizations, and Sarah mentioned this, started covering the suburbs, Andrew came in and said, you know what, we're gonna move back to the city. We're gonna leave this suburban office and go where our people are. We're gonna launch a number of new initiatives, unapologetically Atlanta. We're gonna host some podcasts with some famous rappers that I sometimes listen to from Atlanta. We're gonna actually cover sports again in a much more in-depth and exhaustive way. And so I know you're investing a lot. You kind of see the AJC's role as potentially the news organization of the South, and I'm from Louisiana, and I love this. So walk us through what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you think this is going to really help build more trust in Atlanta and throughout the South.
Sure. So look, thank you for the kind words, and we're trying to do something I think that to a certain degree hasn't been done before, where there's been so much focus on these news deserts and the wars that we've lost, and so there's been a retrenchment, and there's been a decline, and we looked at the situation and said, well, wait a second, Atlanta's it's the 6th largest metropolitan area in the United States. It is arguably the most important, Georgia is the most important political state in the country, and it has been one of the most significant and influential states in the last 3 presidential election cycles. So the political story in Georgia is really important. As you said, it has the most dynamic black community anywhere in the world. Atlanta's #1 export is black culture. And there's an expression, Atlanta influences everything. So that's something that has resonance. The Atlanta Braves are the team of the Southeast United States. The University of Georgia football team is one of the has global following. So there are all these elements, and those elements tie to a real audience opportunity. So we began with, what's the market opportunity? We approached this first and foremost from a business perspective. Is this a viable business? And we sort of said, well, it's a shame that we're in the middle of this critically important city, in this critically important state, in a hugely important part of the country that is undercovered and under-resourced. And the AJC is a brand that's existed for about 150 years. It's meant something to the South. It's still, the journalism has always been critically important, the essential journalism. So we had all these component parts, and we said, well, we can't cut our way to prosperity. We've sort of seen all these examples of organizations, in decline. Let's invest. So when you believe you have a sizable market, then the next thing that comes is, okay, well, how do you serve these audiences? So we drew a dartboard on a whiteboard in my office with Atlanta in the middle, Georgia in the next ring of the circle, then the South, then the country, and then ultimately the world. We say if we do Atlanta exceptionally well, but not just general news, but we can cover politics for the political junkies, well, we'll pick up subscribers in Atlanta, throughout Georgia, throughout the rest of the country. If we can launch a new product focused on Black culture, and again, it's not just a content vertical, but for us, we saw an audience opportunity in the same way the New York Times had built-in audience behaviors around games and cooking. We have built-in audience behaviors around Black culture. So we said if we launch an entirely new product focused on that, we'll pick up subscribers not just in Atlanta and Georgia, but in Detroit and New York and LA and Chicago and Memphis and Nashville and beyond. And then the next thing you need is investment. And we're fortunate enough to be owned by private ownership, the Cox family that have owned this paper for generations. So unlike some news organizations that are owned by owners that have come in recent times because they thought it would be neat to own a paper and have discovered that it's a lot harder than they realized, we have ownership that cares deeply about the mission. So we thought we had all the component pieces in place. And so, Katrice, then what we did is we said, okay, well, we've got a great brand. We have a really big addressable market. We've got ownership that cares about us. Next thing we need is the right talent, the right culture, a level of investment and time. And so our ownership said, great, go for it. So that's what drew me to Atlanta. And then as we've gotten started, we've really had to put our money where our mouth is. So moving back into the city, we faced the same exact thing that Sarah mentioned. Like, we'd made a tactical decision a decade ago, to move to the suburbs. And it wasn't just a physical move, it was to focus on a specific subset of audience. It wasn't the right decision. So now we've had to recommit. So we are there, we're back in Midtown Atlanta, and we're there every day. Our motto now, our mantra, which you can see on the sides of buildings, we have plastered throughout the city, is we write for the greater Atlanta. And we're about 2 years into this little adventure now. We grew subscribers 15% last year, and I'm not sure there's another news organization that's had that level of subscriber growth. We launched UATL, this new product, and it has 35,000 members now, and we're adding a paid tier in 2 months. And so we're well on our way. It's really, really hard, but it's probably the most fun I've had in a really long time.
The last thing I'll say too is I think it's also impressive, as you said, politics is a divisive topic, but we're going to double down, especially in Georgia, where I think all of us, and I currently live in Texas. I do live in Texas, which, you talk about political strife. Georgia's the same way. And so you said, this might probably upset some of our readers, but we got to go there. Walk us through that decision.
Yeah, look, we lean into it. We do it because it's important and because people care about it. And so again, we do it through a lens of putting the truth and the facts first. And so it's really, really important. My colleagues, Jim Van de Hey and Mike Allen at Axios, like to talk about being clinical. We try to be clinical in our approach. And Julie referenced this as well. We're not at war with Donald Trump. Our job is to report the truth and the facts. And so we've established this franchise, Politically Georgia, which has a great podcast with Greg Bluestein, Patricia Murphy, and Tia Mitchell, who are all fixtures on national networks, and Greg's a former AP reporter, so really, really great reporters at the helm. It's a daily podcast. We have a daily newsletter. We've devoted more reporters to covering politics, and we've brought in more contributors. So Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor who was a Republican and famously wouldn't back Trump and spoke at the DNC, he's one of our regular columnists now. We've tried to build this big franchise. When I write letters to our subscribers telling them about what we're doing, I get, typically every letter I write, I get about 1,000 responses back, and I try to answer every one. About a third of them say, keep doing what you're doing, we love you. About a third of them say, you're totally in the tank for the left and we hate you. And about a third of them say, you're totally in the tank for the right, we hate you. The ones There are some that are so nasty and so brutal, and they'll say, you are a worthless piece of, whatever, we hate you, how can you be so blindly partisan and liberal, you're a disgrace, and your children should be embarrassed. And what I will do is I'll write back, and I'll say, dear Miss Hardy, I'm sorry that you think I'm a worthless piece of shit, and I'm sorry that you, think my children should be embarrassed. We're for the truth and the facts in our reporting. We don't get everything right. Not every adjective is perfect. Not every story we select is perfect, but our reporting is about the truth of the facts. On our opinion section, we're going to have a wide variety of opinions, not one worldview. Some papers have decided that. I don't think that's the right call. You might not agree with every opinion that you read, but that's what we're committed to. And we've grown subscribers to our politics coverage rather than lost them through that approach.
It's amazing. I think all of us have, Julie, internationally for you, locally and regionally for you, Andrew, all of us have gotten those phone calls, and most often it's an email, and they can hide behind it, or nasty messages on Instagram or, some social platform. And I think many of us have been labeled the liberal media, right? Nothing burned me up more than when I would get those emails. And often when I would respond as an editor of different places, I would always do exactly like you did. Hey, here's what we did, here's what we read. And you're telling me we're the liberal media because before I got here, the editorial section endorsed Hillary Clinton, which was the only president in history they endorsed that wasn't conservative. So people would go back really far, but I think that's something that we face significantly. And I know that whole line between editorial, columnizing, reporting and writing, when do we use the word claims? We were having discussions at the Dallas Morning News before I left about even using the word experts, and instead saying, here's what the person has done or accomplished, and you can decide for yourself. But walk me through some of the things that you guys have all done and in response to kind of this vitriol response that we get when we write something pretty much that they just don't want to hear.
I would say maybe two things. I think the first is, look, when we get that criticism, I think the first thing you have to do is actually take it seriously for a minute, right? Not dismiss it out of hand and say, is there something that we are doing that is leading people to believe that coverage of a particular issue, a topic, has bias in it? And really, have the conversation honestly in your newsroom. And I think there's nothing wrong with coming to the conclusion that, hey, yeah, we maybe didn't handle that right. I think it's really important to have that conversation. And then one just very tactical thing that we talk about a lot, I say in a lot of news meetings, particularly around fraught topics, and feels like almost anything right now is fraught, but particularly fraught topics, because I often will say, this is a story where adjectives are not your friend, right? It's just that one word you throw in the middle of a sentence, and people say, aha, see, there's the bias. There's the bias right there. And you just take that word out, and suddenly it reads totally different, right? It's so simple, and yet we make that mistake over and over again. And I love beautiful prose. I love beautiful writing, but sometimes we kind of get in our own way with just one adjective. So it's something we talk about a lot, particularly with Washington coverage, also Middle East coverage.
I don't want to offend anybody, but I hate opinion sections, and was like, we're not having one at Outlier, and I feel very strongly about that because I think it's very confusing for audiences to try to take apart what is a columnist talking about versus what is a reporter talking about, and a lot of columnists call themselves journalists, so that makes it much more difficult. So that's one thing, is I think opinion should have a separate space and doesn't need to be inside of a news organization. The other thing is I really do think that agenda setting role that a lot of news organizations see themselves doing is very difficult. It's very difficult to say, trust us, we're gonna tell you what's important, but also trust us, we're very balanced, right? So what we try to do is be very transparent in the ways that we make decisions, right? So I think our news audience knows that we make decisions based on these surveys, and we change our beats based on Detroiters' information and accountability needs. And then the other thing that we do when we're doing investigations or anything that requires a lot of resources, because we're a small newsroom, is that we use it's a harm matrix, basically. And so we're putting our resources towards stories where harm is really widespread in Detroit, or harm is not very widespread, but very acute, and particularly at the hands of the state, where people have less power. And then the last thing is like harm that is only happening in Detroit and not really in other places. And so we know that that's like an accountability problem that could be addressed in Detroit if other places have figured it out. And so that's also like, that's the way that we really make decisions. And we can tell our audience that and have them understand then, based on that, why we've made subsequent decisions. And again, they can disagree with it, but they're disagreeing with something very like fundamental, not something that is about bias or a particular adjective. We can have like a deeper conversation, which I think is more productive.
Look, we've just returned to the fundamentals to a certain degree, and I do think that there are generational shifts in all of this. Like when I was starting my career, I started my career at ABC News, and Peter Jennings was still anchoring World News Tonight. And if I threw in an errant adjective into a script that I wrote, or if I put forward an opinion in a piece that I wrote, he would eviscerate me, just eviscerate me. And sometimes I think there's been a generational shift in newsrooms where there are some journalists in our newsroom who believe we should be advocates, and I don't. I don't think that's our place. I think, again, in terms of opinion, I think there are places for opinion, I think there are places for advocacy, and I think there's some great organizations that are advocacy reporting organizations that serve a purpose. That's not ours. And so we've had really direct conversations with reporters saying, look, our job's to report the facts, and if there is a need to drive accountability, if we dig and dig and dig and report the facts will more than speak for themselves. And so I think there's been that adjustment. Same thing in story selection. Like, there are innumerable stories out there. Take the last 3 days aside. There are innumerable stories out there about negative impacts of the Trump administration's tariff policies. We said, are there any companies, are there any small businesses in Georgia that might benefit from tariffs? Let's go find one. So one of our reporters based on the coast in Savannah, Georgia, went out and reported on a shrimp business that stood to benefit from tariffs. We didn't say tariffs are good or tariffs are bad, and we had plenty of stories indicating the harm that tariffs would do to individuals or institutions, but it is also true that this one, family-owned shrimp business stood to benefit. So I think for us, it really is getting back to the fundamentals, and I agree with so much of what Julie said in the beginning. Like, it's one adjective can undermine trust and credibility. And again, if I tried to throw those adjectives as my earlier work, I wouldn't have gotten promoted. I mean, simple as that.
I think we've all had these internal conversations, and we'll end with just kind of one takeaway. And before I jump there, I'll say, also our own social presence, how we portray ourselves, what we like, don't like. I once had somebody text me and say, hey, are you guys paying attention to which of your reporters just liked a tweet from Taylor Swift? Okay, you know how many millions of people like tweets? And it was a tweet that she had posted after she had decided she was going to endorse Kamala Harris. Well, I'm like, there are 50, I don't know how many people at that point. I couldn't go through. Well, someone on our staff did and pointed out that we had 2 reporters who had. And I mean, our readers are paying careful attention. Who has that kind of time? I don't know, but a few people noticed. And so I would like to just kind of say one takeaway, and how are you guys handling kind of the advocacy versus someone on your staff might say, that's not really advocacy. I have a right to express my opinion because I like Taylor Swift in that case.
We have this conversation a lot, and somewhat similar to what Andrew said. I think there are some amazing organizations out there across the spectrum that do more advocacy journalism, and if you're the kind of journalist that wants to do that work, you should absolutely go do it. You're probably not going to be able to do that for the AP, right? And that's also okay. Like, we have to just be honest about that. For who we are, for the audience that we serve, for the mission that we have, that's not going to be a good fit for us, which doesn't mean you can't play that role somewhere else. And I think too often maybe news organizations have tried to find a way to accommodate that, and I understand the impetus there, but I just ultimately think there's a space for it. It just may not be with us.
Yeah, I think for us, we feel like, well, let me speak for myself. I feel like we have, such a such a big megaphone because we have this constitutionally protected job, and so we can really use our speech and our voice in a very protected way. I don't, however, so I don't, believe in that. I'm not going to go to a protest. I'm not going to do anything like that. At the same time, I'm also not going to stop my staff from doing so. I do think that Detroiters trust us. They do know what we report on. They know the reporters well. And I don't think that they expect, and again, we're in a local context, but I do not think that they expect that the reporters to not have lives outside of their profession. I think that we have built a relationship with Detroiters where our reporters can be full people and express all kinds of sides of themselves and still be trusted to do their job and to look at things through the lens of how does this impact Detroiters. But that's, I think, a privilege that you have at a local level that maybe does not work in a more regional or national context.
Yeah, look, and I think that's really important, and I agree with what Sarah said and Julie said. I think every organization's different, and so there is not a one-size-fits-all. And I think what's great is, as Sarah's built her organization from the ground up, she's able to set standards, and she's able to set clear expectations, and says, like, this is what our organization stands for. And so, therefore, you're able to shape a really clear value proposition with the people of Detroit so they know exactly what the Outlier is, and that builds trust. They can totally trust it. The AP was built to do something else, and so what works for the Outlier doesn't work for the AP. And same for the AJC. We have to. What's important for any organization is to have clear and transparent standards. So one thing that we had at CNN when I was there, I spent the previous 10 years at CNN, was we had a group called the Triad that was made up of our head of standards and practices, our head of the row, which is kind of our quality control group, and our head of legal. And that was kind of the bedrock foundation of the organization. And for generations, for 20, 30 years, they ensured that every piece of journalism that passed through CNN adhered to those standards, and it created some level of consistency. I think as costs have been cut, standards have been cut. And I think a lot of organizations are not clear and transparent with their audiences. And so as a result, employees who don't see that transparency with the audiences don't have those lines in the sand. So my employees at the AJC can't do what folks at the Outlier can do. One isn't better than the other, but as long as we're clear and say this is what working at the AJC means, because this is what we're telling the community, then I think it's understandable. It's when you blur the lines and don't have standards that it becomes really problematic.
Thank you all. I think we'll open it up for any questions.
Hi. Hi. Yes. Do you think that sometimes lack of trust is also caused by lack of diversity at newsrooms and the level of depth sometimes news coverage have? For example, I come from Georgia, country, not the state. And when sometimes I look at news coverage from international leading newspapers, I see that stories written by Northwestern Medill graduate American or Oxbridge graduate Britain, where journalists from Georgia are used as freelancers or fixers, and they don't get the opportunity to work for this big publication and tell local stories. There is one reporter covering entire Middle East, one reporter covering Eastern Europe, Russia. So this is well-known fact for news leaders like you. So what do you do to solve this problem? Thank you.
Well, from an international perspective, I can say, we have really prioritized, probably for about the last decade at AP, with our international staff. Like, historically, yes, it was a lot of sort of foreign correspondents coming from America or coming from the UK, going around the world and working with kind of local staff who are fixers, stringers, et cetera. We've really prioritized hiring local staff as our full-time staff. So one example, our team in India. We have a really large team in India. They are all Indian. And we think about diversity then within that group. When I think about our staff covering the war in Ukraine, they are largely Ukrainian. Our team on the ground in Gaza, they're all Palestinian. Our team on the ground in Israel, largely Israeli. And so they bring a different perspective. It also brings challenges. You know, we're talking about perspective, we're talking about bias. It also brings particular challenges, but it's been really important for us to make that transition. It's a journey, right? I mean, we're a 178-year-old organization trying to kind of turn something that we've done for a really long time, but I'm really proud of the fact that we're committed to doing that. It makes the journalism better.
Great. Hello, I think we had a question on this side.
Thank you. Hi, Julie. Hi, Sarah. Andrew. Martin Reynolds, Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. I have a question about this notion of decorum. It seems that in many respects, journalism, particularly mainstream journalism, has had a difficulty speaking to when things are truths or lies. There's been a lot of issue, particularly in covering the Trump administration in its first term, about how to approach this in fear of being perceived as biased or taking a position. And I wonder at what point in time we have enough information, the preponderance of evidence leads us to need to take more of a position in our reporting. And so I'm curious about that tension. And there was a session today that talked about technology and the shift in what's happening in this notion of fascism, that technology is actually the way it's being approached by some is through this lens of approaching fascism. And I'm worried and concerned that we as journalists are still following the old rules, and that we think the stories are gonna save us, the incremental turn of the screw. And so I'm curious, how should we approach coverage at a time when the rules are shifting faster than perhaps we would like them to?
Can I take this
Question,
one?
yes, please.
I think it's the same thing that we were just talking about before, where like different newsrooms can have different standards, but need to be very clear about what those are and transparent with their audience. So I think that, for example, Outlier uses this harm framework, and we're very clear about that, and that's what we talk about, and that's what we're looking for, and that's where we know we need to go to the mat internally when we see that harm. And I think a lot of news organizations have a hard time because they don't know when they go to the mat, because just covering something is not actually enough of a reason to know when to escalate, right? If you just cover something, then you just cover when it escalates, and you just cover when it escalates, and it's like, really, when do you kind of stake a position that this is very, very serious? What do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I think that I agree with you that one more incremental turn of the screw is not going to make the difference, but I also don't think moral indignation does either. I think in the first Trump administration, look, I was at CNN for the first Trump administration, so I had a front row seat to all of this. And there was a point in time in the beginning where we were so committed, where there are things that are happening that are not true, and we must call them out. And we hired fact checkers, and we called them out, and we were relentless. And at some point in the process, because the rules changed and not everybody was playing by the rules, it threw us off our game. I think it threw the media off its game. Technology is key, but the problem is most newsrooms have ceded the ground of technology to the tech platforms. That's wrong. I think there's no reason why we can't invest in great engineering talent and great product development talent and in world-class platforms to make sure that trusted, incredible journalism hits people in exactly the same way. And again, that's where it comes back to investment. You can't cut your way to prosperity. If you outsource technology and you lean on third-party distribution, you're not going to survive. But if you can invest in really distinctive reporting and you dig and you dig and you dig, the news and the facts, along with world-class engineering talent and product development, go to any university down the street, whether it's in Italy or whether it's in Detroit or New York City or Atlanta. Hire the best engineers. Don't let them go to the platforms. So I think if we just start letting our moral indignation take over, we undermine the trust and credibility in journalism. It's tough. Nobody likes to be pushed around on the playground, but when you lose your temper, you've lost the battle.
I want to thank this amazing panel for the conversation today, and I really appreciate you all for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.